After World War II, Sicily saw a dramatic shift in power, particularly in the world of organized crime. The mafiosi, seeing a new world brimming with wealth and opportunity, sought to seize control of industries that were flourishing. These strategic players identified successful businesses and families, and in a sinister twist, resorted to kidnapping as a means to wrestle away control. In a shadowy dance of negotiations, families, desperate to save their loved ones, sold houses, remortgaged properties and drained savings. Negotiations with the mob were conducted in secrecy, only through lawyers and discreet phone calls. Meanwhile, the mafiosi cunningly solidified their influence, recognizing Sicily's potential as a tourist haven. Real estate values soared, landowners held onto properties for speculation, and the mafia tightened its grip on the island's burgeoning economy. Thus, a pandemic of kidnappings swept across Sicily, leaving families scrambling to protect their loved ones from the clutches of an increasingly sophisticated and ruthless organized crime syndicate. The founding fathers of Sicily's criminal underworld emerged as serious players, controlling real estate, industries, and the very fabric of Sicilian life. However, beneath the surface, a darker, more sinister operation was unfolding, far more strategic than what was portrayed to the public. Mafiosi saw thriving industries in the hands of savvy business people and families, and they sought to take over these enterprises. The question arises, why would a family with a successful business and solid reputation hand over their enterprise to a mafioso or a mob-controlled bank? The grim answer lies in a nefarious tactic: kidnapping. Desperate to free their loved ones, families resorted to extreme measures. They sold houses, remortgaged properties, and scraped together funds in any way possible to secure their relatives' release and bring them back home. The mafiosi manipulated these families' desperation, turning their distress into opportunities to extend their control over Sicily's economic landscape. Here is the article. 5-year-old Graziella Ortiz Patino reunited with her mother after being released in October for a ransom of £1,136,000. Graziella was seized on her way to school near Lake Geneva. Patrizia Valisi, 22, was held captive for 15 days by kidnappers, who last July dragged her from her car in the Milan suburbs. Police traced the gang and released her unharmed before the £2 million ransom demanded could be paid. Paul Getty Jr., grandson of the late American oil magnate, was 17 when he was held for 5 months by the Calabrian Mafia in 1973. He was released minus an ear for a ransom of £1.25 million. Gianni Bulgari, 37, one of Italy's leading jewelers, was held captive for a month in a metal cage, chained by an ankle. He was released in May 1975 after a ransom officially put at £600,000, but reputedly much higher. Cristina Mazzotti, 18, abducted in 1975 in the Italian Lakeland, was killed by her kidnappers after a ransom of over £1 million had been paid. She was given an overdose of drugs when they feared pursuit. Tavernola, Italy. Police pull out a body inside a cloth bag, fastened to a stone, from the water of the Iseo Lake, northern Italy, Saturday. Doctors and lawyers who have examined the body on Sunday have identified him as Vittorio Di Capua, 68, a sports businessman kidnapped in Milan in March this year. Ermino Rimoldi, 45, owner of a Milan building firm, is embraced by his father-in-law after being freed by police last May. He spent most of his 10 weeks' captivity in a soundproof trunk, bound and gagged. Professor Rosario Nicolo, Dean of Rome University's Law School, was overjoyed after his release for a £600,000 ransom. He was held in a small, windowless room for 5 weeks. His captivity was an enormous psychological strain, he said. Patrizia Spallone, 11, looks unaffected by her kidnapping earlier this year. She was seized on her way to school, but freed by police. Many private schools now have armed guards, and richer parents send children to be educated abroad. At Milan Police Headquarters, Commander Pagnozzi, the chief of the Squadra Mobile or Flying Squad, sits contemplating a pile of 5 or 6 tape recorder cassettes on his desk, stout shoulders hunched protectively over them, like a mother bird with a brood which might develop significance with the right care. The tapes carried the record of the brief exchanges between kidnappers and the families, picked up by police phone tapping. They are virtually the only clues Pagnozzi has. The voices making the demands were mostly identifiable as Southern Italian, more emphatic in cadence, the ends of words chipped away. This regional colouring invariably meant Mafia of some persuasion, Sicilian or Calabrian. The dialogue runs to a familiar pattern, the kidnapper's side terse and peremptory, turning any inquiry about the captive's health back to the question of the money. That is the figure decided. I am not permitted to negotiate. And on the other side, the voice of the relative or lawyer appointed to handle the dealing for the family, tending towards a stilted formality in an effort to sound cool. You seriously exaggerate the resources of this particular family. After all, possible loans have been raised. Before a brusque ring-off from some unknown telephone box closed the session. The family is thrown back into its mood of helpless isolation, which all who have experienced it say is their starkest memory of this crime. Pagnozzi reflected on the extreme difficulties for the police. Kidnapping is the most frustrating job we have. The sole concern of the family is for us to stay out of the way until the ransom is paid and the captive is home again, safely. And we comply. It is a whole gang we are dealing with, not just 1 or 2 delinquents we can follow and arrest. We cannot risk a shootout when the money is being handed over, or some member of the family might get killed as well as the captive. The police cannot trace a phone call speedily enough, so they are left mostly with the usual routine slog, picking up underworld whispers and the tapes. The commander's internal telephone jangled briefly. It was his phone-tapping post reporting a sudden development in the affair Crespi, one of the missing businessmen. "The deal seems to be moving, but I can't tell you about it," said Pagnozzi. "Watch the newspapers." 2 days later, the Milan evening paper carried front-page news of the release of Giampiero Crespi, 59, owner of a textile mill on the edge of Milan's smog. He had been captive for 28 days, and his family had paid 1 billion lire, about £670,000, to get him back. The kidnappers had released Crespi, bruised and shaken, in a Lombardy village. Crespi's case aptly illustrated a typical Italian kidnapping. He was one of those who had arrived at middling rich status in the last decade or so, employing 300 workers making material for blue jeans, and owning a mansion with lawns and a swimming pool. One evening in mid-June, near his entrance gates, his car was rammed, and 3 armed masked men dragged Crespi into a third car and disappeared at speed. As far as Crespi could recall, in the story gasped out at the village police station. He and his captors changed cars 3 or 4 times en route to the hideout to elude pursuers, so he had no idea where he was taken. The other details were a reminder of how the kidnapping technique had been perfected over the years. Crespi had been chained hand and foot to a bed and dosed with sedatives to make him docile and fog his perception. He was kept inside a tent set up in the room so that he would never be able to recall the wallpaper, pattern, or the view from a window. His guards were always masked and never spoke to him. He was mostly blindfolded with sticking plaster, and his ears were plugged with wax so that he could never pick up an accent or an identifiable sound. These precautions have become standard practice among the more professional gangs since 1974, when the memory of one captive for minute details, the sound of church bells and of light aircraft taking off in the distance, had enabled police to pinpoint the farm where he had been kept and arrest some of the gang. One explanation for the apparently unstoppable rhythm of Italian kidnappings was that the gangs were mostly professionals who had taken pains to learn. They now operated a well-tried technique with confidence, like a regimental drill, knowing that it almost always worked. The Italian police system has its shortcomings, but any force would now find it a severe challenge to beat on its own. While Crespi was kept in his state of suspended shock, the gang's telephones was putting the family through the hoop. The ransom demand started off with the stunningly impossible, as usual. The relatives were told to find 10 billion lire, £6.7 million, if they wanted to see Crespi alive again. They were left to sweat over this demand for a week or so with no further word, all part of the technique of injecting despair into the family, so that the still enormous sum finally agreed would be paid quickly, and almost with relief. The demand was brought down to 2.6 million and left hanging there for a while before the gang at last settled for £670,000. With a little risk, this gang had thus acquired the proceeds of about 30 average bank robberies in one haul. The rise of Italian kidnapping can be explained in one way as just a matter of criminal economics. It pays better than any other kind of crime, with much less trouble. It continues to grow. The number of kidnappings will approach 500 by the end of this year, at the present rate of 1 every 5 days. The ransoms paid total £30 million so far. The average ransom demands have roughly doubled since the wealthy residents of the industrial north became prime targets about 5 years ago. No more than 10% of the kidnappers are arrested, and only 5% are convicted. The extortion has been steadily worsening as the kidnappers prove, with experience, that another family nest egg can always be extracted if they delay and threaten long enough. Back in the prosperous days of the 1960s, some of the gangs could seem almost reasonable. Selling all the family jewelry, clearing bank accounts, redeeming some shares might be enough for them. Now it is a demand to sell the seaside villa, mortgage the house, and get your parents or in-laws to do the same, or put your textile machinery in pawn to the bank, or you will not see your loved one alive again. The great majority of the captives have been men, either the head of the family himself, who has occasionally had to negotiate the price of his release while in shackles, or one of the grown-up sons. Young women and children make up a small proportion of the total, though these have included some of the more notorious cases, and the price is the same. A ransom of £800,000 was paid for the release of the 4-year-old child of a Genoa industrialist. The unease among the upper industrial class has been widespread, as the kidnappers have picked out some of the leading figures in a wide variety of business enterprises. But sometimes the gangs have found leading figures too well guarded, and they have come down the scale to the smaller factory owners, the proprietors of a few shops, or some distant relative of an industrial magnate. Whatever the level of wealth, it is the family itself which has to absorb the shock of the experience, with often little outside help. This is not new for Italy. The extended family has always been supposed to be the cornerstone of the nation, as far as it has one. A kind of mutual aid society, used to coping with the disasters which central government overlooks, or for which there is no ready-made answer in a chronically disunited state. Some researchers had thought the family was fading as an institution in this sense. The response to the kidnappers has shown that its sense of obligation to family relationships is still intact. This may not be the good thing, it seems, since the ransom demand is pitched higher to take account of it. When the situation cries out for consistency and firmness from central government, it is probably not a good thing that the family should prove itself so self-reliant. Ransoms are nearly always paid, somehow. The sitting ducks are picked off one by one. Though the payments may put some of the families in debt for a lifetime, the first newspaper photographs after release always show happy smiles. This is partly because at the back of the family's mind is the thought that some kidnapped people do not come back. The bodies of 6 have been found by police searches. 28 others have been missing for so long they are presumed to be dead. So, private security firms sprout and do well, hiring out bodyguards at £500 a month, or fitting bulletproof armor to a car, or teaching chauffeurs evasive driving. More guns are sold, and so are devices like cigarette cases and lipsticks with alarm buzzers. However, one seldom hears of these devices brought into play at the crucial moment. As the chief of a security firm admitted, "We do nothing to reduce kidnapping. We just protect our client, and the gang moves on to an easier target." Many of the rich send their families out of the country, as has happened with the children of Sofia Loren and Gina Lollobrigida. The number of Italian children in Swiss schools is said to have doubled, but this did not prevent the kidnapping of Graziella Ortiz in Geneva. While insurance against abduction is illegal for Italian companies, due to the high temptation for fraud, a number of policies have been taken out with Lloyd's of London, with annual premiums ranging up to £15,000 for coverage of about £700,000. Meeting a victim's family, the strongest impression is of their frightening isolation. It is true that some of this comes from their own request, that the police keep out of it. But there is a growing anger, not before its time, that the authorities should let things come to this. I saw the Valisi family, for instance, whose daughter Patrizia, 22, was kidnapped on July 5th. She was one of the rare and lucky ones to be rescued before the ransom was paid. The place where she was held captive, an apartment in the Milan suburbs, was surprisingly revealed to the Carabinieri by a leading Mafia gang member who had been arrested for another crime. To the family's astonished delight, Patrizia was released unharmed just when the negotiations over a £2 million ransom demand were looking their grimmest, with 3 of the kidnappers arrested. Patrizia's father, Giuseppe Valisi, owns a small factory with 100 workers producing building components. We couldn't possibly afford a fraction of the sum demanded, but I immediately began trying to raise as much as I could through bank loans, mortgages, and so on. There were 9 more phone calls to the Valisi home during the 15 days Patrizia was held. We felt completely alone. Nobody from the town council to the central government seemed to care. Only the Carabinieri did their duty with great devotion. It's the government's fault that these things happen. Despite the rescue of Patrizia, the Valisis feel badly affected by the shock of insecurity in the experience. It makes our work in building up the business seem meaningless. But where is it safe to go if we move away? The answer to her question is, probably nowhere in Italy, where a creeping unease about the future affects everyone. Even the political extremists of the left and right have joined in kidnappings from time to raise funds and get publicity. An ominous relationship between the supposed idealists and the underworld thugs. Other Italian factors helping the kidnap industry along are the wide disparities in wealth between the mass of workers in the factories and the upper industrial class. There was a kidnapping tradition to be copied, and an even stronger one of a well-organized and secretive gang system through the various regional formations of the Mafia. Today's kidnappings are carried out by several different kinds of gangs. The most prominent among them is a loose consortium of Sicilian and Calabrian Mafia, at least several hundred strong in its northern membership. The second layer of the kidnap business, the police say, is in the hands of ordinary professional criminals who moved into it from robbery and such like when they saw the easier profits to be made. On the fringe are petty crooks and imitators, whose nervousness makes them more dangerous to the captive. The gangs do not stint on manpower. The police reckon on a gang of up to 25 people in any serious bid for a big ransom, where it may be necessary to hold the captive for several months. There will be 4 or 5 men to study the movements of various target people and do the armed capture, at least the same number of guards, 1 or 2 women to keep house and help with the innocent front, a telephonist to deal with the family, and other people arranging things for the boss or cervello, brains. In some operations, the hired labor is said to be engaged on a fixed fee, win or lose. Means the boss may need to raise substantial capital, possibly $100,000, before the operation begins. A conspicuous figure in the kidnapping business and the development of the Mafia generally was Luciano Liggio. He was a heavy-set young man of stormy temper, originally a cattle thief, who advanced his progress through skill with a war-surplus Sten gun, forming a group of ruthless associates. Trade union leaders and others who got in the way were erased. During the 1960s, the Mafia began spreading northward through Italy. Some members were in flight from the law, while others, like Liggio, seized the chance to organize new rackets in territories growing rich with opportunities. The great internal migration of southern Italians to the factories of the north brought 250,000 Sicilian workers to Milan alone, including material for the mafiosi who wanted to enlarge membership of the delinquent brotherhood or set up protection rackets among the wage earners. By 1970, Milan was seeing shootouts and executions as rival gangs fought to control the smuggling trade with Switzerland, rackets in narcotics, stolen art, and protection. But it would be a mistake to think that delinquent Sicilians or Calabrians are prone to violence and also like things in disarray. Sicily provides Italy with some of its most orderly bureaucrats and talented administrators. The Mafia also likes things tidily organized. In this spirit, a number of Mafia leaders held a summit meeting at the Park Hotel Zurich in 1972, according to evidence given to the government's Anti-Mafia Commission. Luciano Liggio was one of those at the table. It is supposed that at this meeting, he was at least one of those who pointed out the scarcely tapped potential of kidnapping. The first hints for the police that kidnapping was being systematically organized came by chance. The police were following up the case of a rich Milan engineer named Pietro Torrielli. He had been released in early 1973 after a ransom of £1 million. The size of the sum was still a novelty then. A tip led the police to a farmhouse near Bergamo. A concealed trapdoor in a stable led along a tunnel to a small concrete cell. Inside, to their surprise, they found another captive, Count Luigi Rossi di Montelera, who had been abducted in Turin 4 months before. The young count, an executive with his family's vermouth company, Martini and Rossi, was tethered on a 4-foot chain. This time the ransom demand of £3.3 million went unpaid. It is one of the rare cases where a victim has been rescued. From this finding, the police were able to see links between several kidnappings and leading mafiosi behind them all. Another clue gave a break. The name on a wine case led the police to a wine shop in Milan run by 2 Sicilian brothers. Phone tapping revealed that a regular caller, an important businessman named Ferrugia, seemed to be in a position to give commands. He was found to be the long-sought Luciano Liggio, living under a respectable disguise in a Milan apartment. He is now serving an 18-year sentence. How can Italy stop the kidnapping rot? Police and magistrates I met with suggested remedies, though most of them need firm intervention by the government in some form. It would be a good first government step to show that it means to back up its magistrates and police with a reasonably consistent line. "One thing we badly need," said Commander Elio Chopper, head of the Rome flying squad, "is a law to compel the police to intervene at once, so there is no more of this letting the relatives pay. This should not be a policeman's decision, but a government one." Chioppa is rightly proud of having broken up a strong international gang which extracted nearly £6 million from 7 Rome families during 18 months of 1974-75. Yet 1 or 2 good coups of detection like this show how a more rational police machine, less entwined with bureaucracy, could improve performance. The structural problems of policing Italy are certainly severe enough without the strains imposed by the peculiar challenge posed by kidnapping. There are 3 forces: the ordinary civil police, the carabinieri, and the finance police, and kidnapping is handled by the first on the scene with no regular system of sharing information. Any major reform of the police, however, is very much part of the law and order question, possibly the biggest issue in Italian politics since it touches on the country's ingrained difficulty in finding a balance between freedom and authoritarianism. Do they want the police rearranged in one force? Wouldn't that be too powerful? They are not sure. History prods their thoughts with doubt. But immediate measures, like ordering the police into a kidnap case from the start, would probably find few opponents. Bank secrecy, which helps the respectable citizens' tax evasion and families to accumulate the wealth to pay ransom demands, is another major obstacle to the police. Senior officers regard it as sadly unlikely to be changed by a government with a precarious majority. Another remedy some favour is to block the bank accounts of families who are being pressed for ransom so that they are simply unable to pay, and the kidnappers know it. 2. Milan magistrates, Ferdinando Pomarici and Giuliano Turone, took a brave lead in attempting to enforce this last year. My reasons are that paying ransoms is totally counterproductive, and we must call a halt somewhere, said Pomarici. Paying up did not even guarantee release. Several of the more brutal cases include those where the family has paid up its $600,000 or so thinking this is the end of the ordeal, only to find the same kind of sum demanded again. The remedy of blocking funds showed a marked decrease in kidnappings in Milan for several months, because the gangs would not risk any hitch in getting the money. Other magistrates thought it put captives at risk, so did not apply the blocking rule. Thus, really effective measures simply wait upon a government ready to look stronger, as is the case with much of the anarchy. Meanwhile, the Milan magistrates are busy trying to set up a group of specialist magistrates and detectives to deal only with kidnap cases. This is promising. But like much else in Italy, it may have to get worse before it gets better. The end.